The morning mist clung to the scarred landscape of northern France like a shroud, masking the most formidable German position on the Western Front. Private Thomas McLeod pressed his face against the cold earth of the trench, peering through the pre-dawn darkness at the imposing silhouette of Vimy Ridge for 2.5 years. This 7-kilometer escarpment had stood as an impregnable fortress, its chalky cliffs bristling with machine gun nests, observation posts, and artillery, positions that commanded the entire WWI. Plain below, the ridge had already claimed tens of thousands of French and British lives. In May 1915, the French 10th Army had hurled itself against these heights in what became known as the Second Battle of Artois, only to be shattered against the German defenses. The British First Army had tried again in September 1915, sending wave after wave of soldiers into the murderous crossfire that swept the slopes. Each assault had ended in devastating failure, leaving the ridge littered with the debris of broken dreams and broken men. McLeod, 19-year-old farm boy from Saskatchewan, had heard the stories whispered in the trenches of the German Fourth Army had transformed every crater, every shell hole, every natural depression into a killing field, creating underground cities complete with hospitals, ammunition stores, and command posts. The Germans called it the Hindenburg Line's northern anchor, a position so strong that Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria himself had declared it impregnable. But now, in the early days of April 1917, something different was stirring. In the Canadian trenches, the first time in the war, all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps were fighting together under a single command. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie, the former real estate agent from Victoria, who had risen through the ranks to become one of the war's most innovative tacticians, had spent months preparing for this moment. Unlike the hasty, poorly coordinated attacks that had preceded them, the Canadians were about to attempt something unprecedented in the history of warfare. The German defenders, members of the 6th Army's elite Bavarian Reserve Corps, had watched the Canadian preparations with growing unease. Their observers had noted the unusual amount of activity behind enemy lines, the constant stream of supplies moving forward, the methodical registration of artillery pieces. Oberst Friedrich von Lossberg, the defensive genius who had designed the ridge's fortifications, had warned his superiors that the Canadians were different from their predecessors. They moved with a precision and purpose that suggested careful planning rather than desperate courage, as referenced in David J. Berkeson's comprehensive study, The Fighting Canadians. The German intelligence reports from this period reveal a grudging respect for Canadian military prowess that was notably absent in their assessments of other Allied forces. The ridge itself told the story of modern warfare's evolution. Its forward slopes were a moonscape of overlapping shell craters, twisted wire, and the bleached bones of previous assaults. The German defenses stretched back in 3 distinct lines, each more formidable than the last. The front line carved into the military crest of the ridge, bristled with concrete machine gun posts positioned to deliver interlocking fields of fire. Behind it, the intermediate line provided depth and redundancy, while the reserve line, positioned on the actual crest, commanded views that stretched for miles in every direction. The stakes could not have been higher. Vimy Ridge was not merely another tactical objective, it was a symbol of German might and Allied impotence. Its fall would open the way to the vital rail junction at Douai, potentially unhinging the entire German defensive system in northern France. More than that, it would prove that the new nation of Canada, barely 50 years old, could accomplish what the great powers of Europe had failed to achieve. The ridge would test not just Canadian military capability, but the very idea of Canadian nationhood forged in the crucible of war. The transformation of the Canadian Corps began in the winter trenches of 1916 to 17. General Julian Byng implemented a revolutionary training program that would reshape the nature of infantry warfare. Unlike the rigid, top-down command structure that had characterized previous Allied offensives, Byng insisted that every Canadian soldier, from private to colonel, understand not just his own role, but the entire battle plan in the frozen training grounds behind the lines. Canadian soldiers practiced a new form of warfare. They built scale models of Vimy Ridge, complete with miniature trenches, wire obstacles, and strongpoints that perfectly replicated the German positions. Private McLeod found himself crawling through mud that had been shaped to match every contour of the ridge, memorizing landmarks that would guide him through the smoke and chaos of battle. The Canadians called it peaceful penetration, but there was nothing peaceful about the intensive drilling that continued day and night. Major General Arthur Currie, commanding the 1st Canadian Division, had studied the failures of Verdun and the Somme with the analytical mind of an engineer. He understood that the war had become a contest between industrial production and tactical innovation, where victory belonged to the side that could best coordinate artillery, infantry, and logistics into a single, devastating instrument. The Canadian Corps possessed advantages that their predecessors had lacked: unified command, superior intelligence, and most importantly, time to prepare properly. The artillery preparation alone represented a revolution in military science. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew McNaughton, the brilliant young gunner who would later become Canada's most famous general, had developed a system of survey techniques that allowed Canadian guns to fire with unprecedented accuracy without the preliminary, ranging shots that typically warned defenders of an impending attack, using sound, ranging, flash spotting, and aerial photography. The Canadians identified and catalogued every German position on the ridge. The scale of the bombardment was staggering. 983 guns, ranging from 80-pounder field pieces to massive 15-inch howitzers, had been assembled for the assault. They represented the concentrated firepower of the entire British Empire, including weapons rushed from Britain, France, and even the United States. The ammunition expenditure planned for the preliminary bombardment exceeded the total production of shells in Canada during the war's first 2 years. But the Canadian secret weapon was not their artillery. It was their intelligence network. For months, Canadian engineers had been digging tunnels beneath no man's land, some extending more than half a mile into German territory. These subterranean passages served multiple purposes. They allowed close observation of German positions, provided covered approaches for assault troops, and most dramatically, they enabled the placement of massive mines beneath key enemy strongpoints. The most ambitious of these tunnels, codenamed Goodman's Subway, stretched nearly a mile beneath the ridge and emerged directly behind German lines. Canadian miners, many of them veterans of the coal fields of Nova Scotia and Alberta, worked in shifts around the clock, their picks and shovels muffled by elaborate sound-dampening systems. They knew that German counterminers were digging toward them, and the underground war became a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the suffocating darkness below the battlefield. The human cost of preparation was enormous. Canadian Corps suffered over 4,000 casualties during the preliminary phase alone. As German artillery and raids took their toll on the crowded trenches, the weather was particularly brutal. During the winter of 1916-17, with temperatures dropping well below freezing and trenches collapsing under the weight of snow and ice, many soldiers suffered from trench foot, a debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure to wet, cold conditions that could lead to gangrene and amputation. As March turned to April, intensity of preparation reached fever pitch. The final rehearsals were conducted with live ammunition, creating a realism that impressed even veteran observers. British staff officers who visited the Canadian positions reported that they had never seen such thorough preparation for a major offensive. The Canadians had learned from the mistakes of their allies and were determined not to repeat them. The German defenders, meanwhile, had not been idle. It strengthened their positions throughout the winter, adding new machine gun nests, deepening their tunnels, and improving their communication systems. The 6th Army's intelligence officers had correctly identified the Canadian Corps as the most formidable opponent they had yet faced, and they prepared accordingly. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Vimy Ridge, but the future course of the war itself. Easter Monday, April 9th, 1917, dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind driving sleet across the scarred landscape of the Western Front. At precisely 5:30 in the morning, the horizon erupted in a wall of flame as nearly 1,000 Canadian guns opened fire simultaneously. The preliminary bombardment, which had been building for a week, reached its crescendo in what German survivors would later describe as the most terrifying artillery display of the entire war. Private McLeod crouched in the forward assault trench, feeling the earth shake beneath his boots as shells screamed overhead. The noise was indescribable, a continuous roar that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth, punctuated by the sharp crack of high-explosive shells and the distinctive whine of shrapnel. Through the smoke and dust, he could see the German positions on the ridge disappearing in a chaos of flame and flying debris. The Canadian artillery plan, meticulously crafted over months of preparation, was unlike anything previously attempted. On the Western Front, rather than the traditional pattern of a brief, intense bombardment followed by an infantry charge, the Canadians employed a creeping barrage that would advance steadily up the slope, with the infantry following close behind. This technique required precise timing and communication between gunners and infantry. With the barrage moving forward at a predetermined rate of 100 yards every 3 minutes, as referenced in Tim Cook's authoritative work, Vimy, the battle and the legend, the complexity of coordinating this barrage involved calculations that pushed the mathematical capabilities of the era to their limits. At 0 hour, the whistle blasts that sent for divisions of Canadian infantry over the top were barely audible above the artillery roar. The 1st Canadian Division, commanded by Major General Arthur Currie, advanced on the right flank toward Hill 145, the highest point on the ridge. The 2nd Division, under Major General Henry Burstall, moved against the center, while the 3rd Division attacked the formidable strong point known as the Pimple. The 4th Division, the newest and least experienced, was tasked with the most difficult objective, the capture of Hill 145, the German defenders, members of the 79th Reserve Division and the 1st Bavarian Reserve. Division had endured a week of continuous bombardment that had shattered their communications, destroyed their forward positions, and left many of them in a state of shock. Oberst Max von Barfeld, commanding the German defenses, had warned his superiors that the preliminary bombardment was unlike anything the Germans had experienced. The English artillery fire has reached a degree of intensity that surpasses all previous experiences, he reported to divisional headquarters as the Canadian infantry emerged from their trenches. They found themselves advancing through a landscape that seemed to belong to another planet. The once familiar contours of no man's land had been obliterated by the bombardment, placed by a chaotic maze of overlapping craters filled with mud, water, and the debris of war. The German wire, which had claimed so many lives in previous assaults, hung in twisted fragments, cut to pieces by the concentrated fire of the Canadian guns. The creeping barrage worked with devastating effectiveness. German machine gunners, stunned by the artillery fire, found themselves unable to establish effective fields of fire before the Canadian infantry was upon them. The Canadians advanced in small groups, using tactics that emphasized flexibility, an initiative rather than the rigid formations that had characterized earlier attacks. Each section was trained to operate independently, bypassing strong points that could not be quickly overcome and leaving them for follow-up troops to deal with. The first German defensive line crumbled within hours. Canadian soldiers, many of them fighting their first major battle, displayed a combination of courage and tactical sophistication that impressed even their enemies. They moved with the confidence of men who knew exactly what they were supposed to do and how to do it. The months of intensive training had created a force that was both disciplined and adaptable, capable of maintaining momentum even when communications broke down and plans went awry. But the Germans were far from defeated. As the Canadians advanced, beyond the first line of trenches, they encountered increasingly fierce resistance. The intermediate line of defense, positioned on the reverse slope of the ridge, had been largely spared from the preliminary bombardment and remained formidable. Machine gun nests that had been missed by the artillery opened fire on the advancing Canadians. And German artillery, though disrupted, began to find its range. The battle for the intermediate line became a series of desperate individual actions. Canadian soldiers found themselves fighting not just for tactical objectives but for survival itself. The carefully planned advance began to break down into a collection of small unit actions. Each fought with the desperate intensity of men who knew that failure meant death. The ridge, which had seemed almost within reach during the first hours of the attack, suddenly appeared as formidable as ever. The morning sun, struggling through the smoke and mist, revealed a battlefield unlike anything in the history of warfare. The 1st Canadian Division had achieved what French and British forces had failed to accomplish in 2 years of bloody attacks. They had broken through the German first line of defense and were advancing steadily up the slopes of Vimy Ridge. But the cost was already mounting, and the most difficult fighting lay ahead. Private McLeod found himself separated from his unit as the carefully organized advance began to fragment under the stress of battle. The creeping barrage had moved ahead of the infantry, leaving isolated groups of Canadians to fight their way forward through a maze of destroyed trenches and shell holes. The German defenders, recovering from the shock of the initial bombardment, were beginning to organize a coherent defense around their remaining strongpoints. The second line of German defenses, positioned along the intermediate slope of the ridge, had been constructed with diabolical ingenuity. Machine gun nests were positioned in mutually supporting positions, the interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible approach. The German engineers had taken advantage of the natural terrain, using reverse slopes and dead ground to create positions that were nearly invisible until attackers were within killing range. Each strongpoint was connected to the others by deep communication trenches that allowed reinforcements to move undetected. Sergeant William Milne, of the 16th Battalion, Canadian-Scottish, found himself leading a scratch group of survivors. From 3 different companies in an assault on a particularly stubborn machine gun nest, the German position, built into a natural fold in the ridge, commanded a clear view of the Canadian advance and had already claimed dozens of casualties. Milne's tactical brilliance lay in his ability to coordinate the actions of men who had never worked together before, welding them into an effective fighting unit through sheer force of personality. The fighting took on an intensely personal character as small groups of Canadians worked their way forward through the German defenses. This was not the mass slaughter of the Somme or Pastiendal, but a series of individual battles fought with rifles, bayonets, and hand grenades. Canadian soldiers displayed a tactical flexibility that reflected their months of intensive training, adapting to changing circumstances with an improvisational skill that their enemies found deeply unsettling. The German defenders, despite their disadvantages, fought with the desperation of men who knew that retreat meant the collapse of their entire defensive system. Lieutenant Hans Ritter, commanding a company of Bavarian infantry, organized a counterattack that briefly threatened to overwhelm the Canadian advance. His men, emerging from concealed positions in the intermediate line, struck the flank of the advancing Canadians with a ferocity that temporarily restored German control over a crucial section of the ridge. The artillery duel that accompanied the infantry battle was equally intense. German guns, repositioned during the night to avoid the Canadian counter-battery fire, began to find their range on the advancing infantry. The Canadian artillery, forced to lift their fire to avoid hitting their own men, could no longer provide the close support that had been so effective during the initial assault. The result was a series of desperate firefights fought at close range, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Major General Arthur Currie, observing the battle from his command post, realized that the attack was reaching a critical juncture. The initial momentum was beginning to dissipate, and German reinforcements were arriving to strengthen their threatened positions. The Canadian corps had achieved more in 6 hours than their predecessors had accomplished in 2 years, but the ridge itself remained in German hands. The question was whether the Canadians could maintain their offensive spirit long enough to complete the breakthrough. The answer came from an unexpected source. Canadian engineers, working under the cover of the artillery barrage, had successfully detonated a massive mine beneath the German strongpoint known as the Pimple. The explosion, which could be heard for miles, created a crater nearly 200 feet across and eliminated an entire German company. More importantly, it created a gap in the German line that Canadian infantry could exploit. The psychological impact of the mine explosion was even greater than its tactical significance. German defenders, already shaken by the intensity of the Canadian attack, began to question whether their positions were truly impregnable. Reports reached German headquarters of Canadian soldiers emerging from tunnels behind German lines, creating panic among defenders who had assumed that their rear areas were secure. The carefully constructed German defensive system was beginning to unravel under the combined pressure of artillery bombardment, infantry assault, and psychological warfare as the day wore on. The character of the battle began to change. What had started as a carefully planned offensive was evolving into a chaotic struggle for individual objectives. With success or failure, depending on the courage and initiative of small groups of soldiers, the ridge, which had seemed like a single formidable obstacle, was revealing itself to be a complex terrain of ridges, valleys, and reverse slopes, each presenting its own tactical challenges. By midday on April 9, the Canadian Corps had achieved something that military experts had declared impossible. They had broken through 2 lines of German defenses and were advancing toward the crest of Vimy Ridge. But the most difficult fighting still lay ahead. As the Germans prepared to make their final stand on the commanding heights that had anchored their defensive system for nearly 3 years, the 3rd Canadian Division, under Major General Louis Lipset, faced the most challenging objective of the day: the capture of the Pimple, a heavily fortified knoll that dominated the northern end of the ridge. The German positions here had been carved deep into the chalk, creating a network of tunnels and bunkers that seemed almost impervious. 2. Artillery fire. The approaches were swept by machine gun fire from multiple directions, and the defenders had the advantage of high ground and excellent observation. Private John Pattison of the 50th Battalion, Canadian Infantry, found himself at the center of the most critical action of the day, armed with nothing but a rifle and a bag of hand grenades. He single-handedly eliminated a German machine gun position that had been holding up the advance of his entire company. His actions, which would later earn him the Victoria Cross, exemplified the individual courage that characterized the Canadian assault on Vimy Ridge. The German defenders, despite their increasingly desperate situation, continued to fight with professional skill and determined courage. Hauptmann Friedrich von Seckendorf, commanding the German garrison on the Pimple, organized a defense that utilized every advantage of terrain and position. His men, veterans of the Eastern Front, understood that the fall of Vimy Ridge would compromise the entire German defensive system in northern France. They fought not just for their immediate positions, but for the strategic integrity of the Hindenburg Line. The Canadian artillery, which had performed so brilliantly during the initial assault, now faced the challenge of providing close support. 2 infantry advancing up steep slopes under enemy observation. The gunners, working from carefully prepared fire plans, attempted to maintain the creeping barrage that had been so effective during the morning assault. But the complex terrain of the ridge made accurate fire increasingly difficult, and the risk of hitting their own men grew with each passing hour, as referenced in Pierre Berton's classic account, Vimy. The coordination between Canadian artillery and infantry during this phase of the battle represented a new level of tactical sophistication that would influence military doctrine for generations to come. The breakthrough came at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when elements of the 1st Canadian Division succeeded in reaching the crest of Hill 145. The view from the summit was extraordinary. For the first time in the war, Allied soldiers could see deep into German-held territory. With the vital rail junction at Dau clearly visible in the distance, the psychological impact of this achievement was enormous, both for the Canadians who had accomplished it and for the German defenders who witnessed it. The collapse of the German position began with increasing speed as the afternoon wore on. Units that had fought with desperate courage throughout the morning began to withdraw in disorder as their positions became untenable. The German artillery, which had been repositioned multiple times during the day to avoid Canadian counter-battery fire, found itself unable to support the infantry as Canadian forces advanced beyond the range of predetermined defensive fires. 4th Canadian Division, despite being the newest and least experienced formation in the Corps, achieved one of the most spectacular successes of the day. Their assault on the northern end of the ridge, initially slowed by fierce German resistance, gained momentum as the afternoon progressed. The division's commander, Major General David Watson, had organized his attack with particular attention to the lessons learned from previous failures on the Western Front. His men advanced in small groups, using fire and movement tactics that kept the Germans off balance and prevented them from organizing effective counterattacks. The capture of the German artillery observation posts marked the beginning of the end for the ridge's defenders. These positions, which had directed devastating fire on Allied positions for nearly 3 years, suddenly found themselves under Canadian control. The psychological impact on German gunners, who could no longer observe the effects of their fire, was immediate and profound. Artillery support for the German infantry began to falter just when it was most desperately needed. By late afternoon, the German command structure on the ridge was beginning to collapse. Communication lines had been severed by the Canadian bombardment, and runners carrying orders between units were being intercepted by Canadian patrols that had infiltrated behind German lines. The carefully coordinated defense that had characterized German tactics throughout the war was giving way to a series of isolated actions, fought by individual units cut off from higher command. The capture of Vimy Ridge was becoming not just a tactical victory, but a strategic triumph that would reshape the entire character of the war on the Western Front. The Canadian Corps had demonstrated that properly planned and executed offensives could break through even the most formidable defensive positions. More importantly, they had shown that the war of attrition that had characterized as the sun began to set on April 9, 1917, the Canadian flag flew from the highest point of Vimy Ridge for the first time in the war. The achievement represented more than just another tactical victory. It marked the emergence of Canada as a military power capable of accomplishing what the great armies of Europe had failed to achieve. But the price of victory was measured not just in strategic advantage, but in the lives of the men who had made it possible. The casualty figures told the story of the day's fighting with stark clarity. The Canadian Corps had suffered over 10,000 casualties, including more than 3,000 dead. These numbers, while substantial, were far lower than the losses incurred in previous assaults on the ridge. The French Second Army had lost nearly 60,000 men in their failed attacks of May 1915, while the British First Army had suffered comparable losses in September of the same year. The Canadian success had been achieved with unprecedented efficiency, but the human cost remained devastating for the families and communities that had sent their sons to war. Private McLeod, who had survived the day's fighting despite being wounded twice, found himself among the Canadian soldiers who spent the night consolidating their hard-won positions. The ridge, which had seemed so formidable from the Canadian trenches, revealed itself from the summit to be a complex terrain of ridges, valleys, and reverse slopes that had concealed the true strength of the German defenses. The German engineers had created a defensive system of extraordinary sophistication, with multiple fallback positions and interlocking fields of fire that had made previous attacks virtually impossible. The German withdrawal, while tactically sound, represented a strategic disaster of enormous proportions. The Sixth Army had lost not just a key defensive position, but the psychological advantage that had sustained German morale throughout the long years of trench warfare. The ridge had been a symbol of German invincibility, a position so strong that its capture had seemed impossible. Its fall sent shockwaves through the German high command and marked the beginning of a gradual but irreversible shift in the balance of power on the Western Front. The Canadian Corps had achieved their victory through a combination of factors that distinguished their assault from previous attempts. The months of careful preparation had created a force that understood not just what they were supposed to do, but why they were doing it. Artillery tactics developed by Lieutenant Colonel MacNaughton and his staff had provided infantry support of unprecedented accuracy and intensity. Most importantly, Canadian soldiers had displayed a level of tactical flexibility and individual initiative that allowed them to adapt to changing circumstances without losing sight of their overall objectives. The immediate aftermath of the victory revealed the broader implications of the Canadian achievement. Capture of Vimy Ridge had opened a gap in the German defensive system that threatened to unhinge their entire position in northern France. The observation posts that had directed German artillery fire for nearly 3 years were now in Canadian hands. fundamentally altering the tactical balance along this section of the Western Front. The vital rail junction at Doya, previously secure behind German lines, was now within range of Canadian artillery. The international recognition of the Canadian achievement was immediate and overwhelming. Newspaper headlines around the world proclaimed the victory as a turning point in the war, with particular emphasis on the role of Canadian forces in achieving what their allies had failed to accomplish. The British press, while celebrating the victory, also recognized that the success had been achieved by soldiers fighting under Canadian command and using Canadian tactical innovations. The Ridge had become a symbol not just of military success, but of Canadian national achievement. The German reaction to the loss of Vimy Ridge was equally telling. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, commanding the German forces in northern France, described the defeat as a catastrophe of the first order that threatened the entire German defensive system. The loss of the Ridge forced a fundamental reassessment of German strategy on the Western Front, with significant resources being diverted to strengthen defensive positions elsewhere. The psychological impact on German soldiers, who had been told that the Ridge was impregnable, was equally damaging to overall morale. The tactical lessons learned from the Canadian success at Vimy Ridge would influence military doctrine for generations to come. The combination of careful preparation, accurate artillery support, flexible infantry tactics had created a new model for offensive operations that would be studied and emulated by armies around the world. The Ridge had become not just a battlefield victory, but a laboratory for the development of modern warfare tactics that would shape the conduct of future conflicts. The morning of April 10th, 1917, dawned clear and cold over Vimy Ridge, revealing the full extent of the Canadian achievement. For the first time in nearly 3 years, Allied soldiers stood on the commanding heights that had anchored the German defensive system in northern France. The victory belonged not to the British Empire or the French Republic, but to Canada, a nation that had entered the war as a colonial dominion and emerged as a military power in its own right. The strategic implications of the Canadian victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantages gained. The capture of Vimy Ridge had demonstrated that the deadlock of trench warfare could be broken through careful planning, innovative tactics, and superior execution. The methods developed by the Canadian Corps would be studied and adapted by military commanders throughout the Allied armies, fundamentally changing the nature of offensive operations on the Western Front. General Sir Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, recognized the broader significance of the Canadian achievement. In his dispatch to the War Office, he wrote that the capture of Vimy Ridge represented a success of the most complete and decisive nature that had been achieved through the skill, courage, and determination of the Canadian Corps. The praise was particularly significant coming from Haig, who had been skeptical of colonial forces' ability to conduct major offensive operations. The human stories that emerged from the battle revealed the personal dimensions of the Canadian triumph. Sergeant William Milne, who had been killed while leading the assault on a German machine gun position, was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his courage and leadership. Private John Pattison, who had single-handedly eliminated a German strong point, became a national hero whose actions were celebrated in newspapers across Canada. These individual acts of courage multiplied across 4 divisions of Canadian infantry. It created a collective achievement that transcended the sum of its parts. The German assessment of their defeat was equally revealing. Oberst Friedrich von Lossberg, the defensive specialist who had designed the Ridge's fortifications, wrote in his post-battle report that the Canadian attack had displayed a level of tactical sophistication and coordination that exceeded anything we had previously encountered. The German High Command, forced to acknowledge the superiority of Canadian methods, began to implement defensive measures specifically designed to counter the tactics that had proven so effective at Vimy Ridge. The international recognition of the Canadian victory helped to establish Canada's reputation as an independent military power. The success at Vimy Ridge, coming after significant Canadian contributions at Ypres and the Somme, demonstrated that Canadian forces could not only hold their own against the best that the German army could offer, but could achieve victories that had eluded their more experienced allies. The ridge became a symbol of Canadian military prowess that would influence the country's international standing for generations to come. The political implications of the victory were equally significant. Prime Minister Robert Borden, who had struggled to maintain Canadian support for the war effort, found himself with a military triumph that justified the enormous sacrifices that Canada had made. The victory at Vimy Ridge provided powerful ammunition for those who argued that Canada deserved recognition as an independent nation rather than merely a British dominion. The ridge had become not just a military objective, but a symbol of Canadian national aspirations. The memorial that would eventually be built on Vimy Ridge, designed by Walter Seymour Allward and completed in 1936, captured the deeper meaning of the Canadian achievement. The monument, with its towering twin pillars and sculptured figures representing the sacrifice of a generation, became a pilgrimage site for Canadians seeking to understand their country's emergence as a nation. The names of the 11,385 Canadians who died in France with no known grave were inscribed on the monument, ensuring that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. The Battle of Vimy Ridge had achieved something that politicians and diplomats had been unable to accomplish. It had demonstrated Canada's emergence as a mature nation capable of independent action and achievement. The men who had fought and died on the ridge had not just captured a strategic position. They had won recognition for their country as a military power deserving of respect and equal treatment. The ridge had become the birthplace of modern Canada, where a colonial dominion had been transformed into a nation through the crucible of war. The legacy of Vimy Ridge extends far beyond the immediate military and political achievements of April 1917. The battle demonstrated that carefully planned operations, supported by innovative tactics and superior preparation, could achieve decisive results even under the most challenging conditions. The Canadian Corps had shown that the Western Front need not be a scene of endless attrition, but could be the stage for dramatic victories that changed the course of history. The ridge had become not just a battlefield, but a laboratory for the development of modern warfare and a symbol of what could be achieved through courage, determination, and superior leadership. In the end, Vimy Ridge mattered not just because of what was accomplished there, but because of what it represented for the future of Canada and the conduct of modern warfare. The battle had proven that a young nation, properly led and prepared, to achieve victories that eluded more established powers. The ridge had become a symbol of Canadian national identity and military excellence that would inspire future generations of soldiers and citizens. The men who fought and died there had not just captured a strategic position. They had won a place in history for their country and themselves that would endure long after the guns fell silent.